Thanks, and thank you everyone for joining today. We'll start with a very brief introduction on what is IRPIC for those who are not familiar. So IRPIC is with an overarching goal of basically enhancing research in the Arctic, bringing together leaders from 18 agencies, department offices across the federal government. It's basically a hub for building connection, facilitating research in a thriving Arctic and Earth. It's an open community, so for anyone who wants to contribute is welcome to join. We have some community of practices, and today we have two community of practices that are enabling this meeting. So we have the terrestrial ecosystem community, which I believe we have Liz that's on the call right now from this community, which their goal is developing a landscape scale understanding of the drivers and impact of terrestrial ecosystem changes. And then we have the permafrost community of practice with Kyle, John, also Lauren and Ben Jones that are not on the call, and myself, with our overarching goal of understanding the processes controlling permafrost dynamics and the impact on the ecosystem, infrastructure, and climate feedbacks. And then so today's presentation is from Josh Koch. He will be talking about his latest publication on the dominance and growth of shallow groundwater resources in continuous permafrost environment. Josh is a colleague. He's at the Alaska USGS Center. He's a research hydrologist. He's also affiliated at the Institute of Arctic and Alpine Research at the University of Colorado. Josh has been at the USGS since 2001. He started as an intern in Massachusetts. You know the state I'm trying to say that I cannot pronounce. And then he moved on to Colorado, working on various projects on groundwater flow and transport, groundwater flow and surface water interaction, all the way going to Vados hydrology and contaminant transport in the Powder River basins of Wyoming. He's now focusing on permafrost hydrology and the implication of warming and thaw on water resources, carbon, solute, and nutrients, fluxes, and ecosystem. So thank you, Josh, for being here today, and I'll let you move with the presentation.
Great. Thank you so much, Ava. And yeah, thanks all for having me. Let me see if I can share my screen successfully. Okay, hopefully you're seeing a full screen there on the presentation. Yeah, so again, Josh Koch, research hydrologist, the Alaska Science Center, thinking a lot about permafrost hydrology. And today I'll talk about a little bit of our work from up in the Anwar region and 1002 region in northeastern Alaska. My project is focused on, I like to think of as Arctic boreal catchment hydrology, but thinking about warming and change through a lot of Alaska, and specifically in the permafrost regions. And again, this green star up in the upper right side of Alaska is showing where this current work was focused. So a lot of my research is related to the Changing Arctic Ecosystem Initiative of the U.S. Geological Survey. And the way I sort of conceptualize this is we have this bottom-up system where we have these changing landscapes and the changing environment related to warming and thaw, leading to changes in our hydrology and the movement of water and solutes and carbon from these landscapes. And then often we're thinking about how this relates to our critical ecosystems in the state. And so while this work was funded by sort of joint USGS and Fish and Wildlife Service, it is getting at sort of these same ideas. We're looking at the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge. This is an area where water is really a critical resource, and it's incredibly limited, partially because most of the year it's it's frozen, and so there's just not that much water. Our rivers freeze solid during the winters in most cases, except in some rare pockets where we're near perennial springs. And these tend to be critical areas in the winter where we have pockets of fish that manage to survive. And so sort of understanding the availability of this winter water was really important to fish and wildlife, especially now and we're in a period where there are potentially multiple uses for these waters from both the ecosystem need. There's been some consideration of development of oil and gas in these regions. And so we wanted to be better able to predict both water availability and the future of water availability. So, we see these small springs and these small pockets of water in the winter. And so we were interested in answering questions related to where does this spring water come from? What is alpha ice telling us about springs or subsurface water? So, as I'm sure we're all familiar, this is a region that's changing pretty dramatically with climate change. There's evidence that we're seeing more rain and especially more late summer rain that's influencing the river hydrographs. We have changes in our alpha ice field. In many senses, they're thawing quicker. Potentially, they're not even developing as much. If there's more flow over the winter months in the rivers, it could be that alpha ice is not developing to the same amount. This third figure on the right here is showing changes in shoulder season discharge in many rivers in Alaska, demonstrating the point that our shoulder season flows and our winter flows tend to be increasing these green colors, whereas our summer flows and even snowmelt pulses may be decreasing, the purple boxes there in the summer months in several of our rivers. So there is some previous work to help us get started with these questions. This is a figure from a publication by Doug Kane and colleagues, where they looked at many of these springs that exist across this region of northeastern Alaska. These springs tend to form near the mountain block or just out into the coastal plain. They used I guess 14C measurements on the DIC to come up with ages for these waters of around 20,000 years, although recognizing that the water was likely flowing through limestone aquifers and so potentially impacted by that carbon dead signature. And so the real ages may be younger than that 20,000. They also looked at stable isotopes of water and came up with this conceptual model of water moving from the Brooks Range Mountains, especially from the south side of the Brooks Range Mountains, and then finding its way to these springs and through faults to reach the surface. There are some other recent work modeling these types of systems and thinking about how we can get water through this region of thick continuous permafrost in situations where we may be able to develop these talics or these preferential pathways that stay thawed and allow for communication and hydrologic connectivity between our shallow and deep flow paths. This was some work from the Yukon River Basin, a large-scale geomagnetic survey aerial base to demonstrate that we see some evidence of these large talics forming near the Yukon River or related to the placement and evolution or migration of the river across its floodplain. So certainly there are ways that we can conceptualize water moving through deep flow paths, but we wanted to revisit this with some updated tracers. And so we were again going to look at many of these different water sources. We sampled these springs, streams and rivers, and some winter water as well. We combined both hydrochemistry, so looking at major ion concentrations and stable isotopes of water. We also used several age tracers, including chlorofluorocarbons and tritium, things that have been elevated in our atmosphere and therefore in our recharge over the last several decades. We also use terrogenic helium. We sampled noble gases, and then you can separate based on sort of the ratio of noble gases to the helium. You can come up with a component of that that's generated from the subsurface as well to get something, learn something about the length of time that our recharge has been in the subsurface. We also looked at these alpha ice fields, which are these large features of ice that develop, especially in our river channels over the winter as groundwater reaches the surface and freezes. We were looking both at the size of those features and how that changed from year to year, and then the relationship of those features to climatology, both of several climate indices as well as previous years' temperatures and precipitation. So to begin with, from the tritium data alone, it became clear that much of our water was very young, in that it had expected concentrations of modern water tritium. So here showing box plots of tritium in our rivers and our streams and our springs. Both the rivers and streams fall well within the expected modeled range of recent precipitation in the region. When we look at the springs, the story gets a little more complex. We see that several of our springs are close to the modern range, although maybe slightly lower. And then two of our springs have even lower concentrations, suggesting that we have some amount of old water or mixing of young and old waters. So the tritium's the simplest way to look at this, and then the next slide will get a little more complex in showing some of our different tracers. So here we're showing that same plot, as well as biplots of tritium and chlorofluorocarbon, here showing CFC11, as well as our terrogenic helium. And it's pretty busy, but the important point, I think, is to recognize that these red circles indicating our young springs, typically we're finding that the ages of that water is less than 30 years and can be explained by an exponential mixing model of groundwater flow. So this is modeled using a lumped parameter model to conceptualize the movement of water through the subsurface. And so these young waters fit well with this model of mixing of young and old, in this case 30-year-old water, in these shallow subsurface flow paths. Two of our water sources, or two of our springs, had much older water. And so these are the diamonds that fall outside of the range of these red circles. And so these were found to be best explained as a mixture of water that's young, around 30 years old, and then some older water. Here we use the end member as 15,000 years. And so the blue lines attempt to bracket these waters. And what we can see is that in many cases, that water is, the numbers along those lines are the fraction of young water. So here, these waters are more than 90% young water with just a little bit of old water. One sample was mostly old water with just a little bit of young water. So again, the main point being that the majority of this water tends to look fairly young, flow path lengths in the subsurface of less than 30 years, with a few exceptions. If we look at the hydrochemistry, so just looking at ion loads, it supports this story where we have fairly low concentrations in these young waters, and then concentrations that are increasing, and in terms of chloride are increasing exponentially in these older waters. If we look at our stable isotopes of water, we again see a story pointing towards local sources of precipitation and limited influence of this sort of unique old water source. So here again, these yellow triangles and red circles are showing the precipitation, both the summer precipitation and sort of the annual mean precipitation. And we see that most of our river water can be explained as falling along this trajectory from summer rain to winter snow. the place where this breaks down a little bit is in the winter, where we're seeing our winter water is looking pretty obviously close to our annual precipitation and remember some more snow-like, but also showing potentially some evidence of flow through the subsurface with some elevated chloride concentrations, and again maybe a little bit of influence from this older spring water. So we wanted to dig a little further into these subsurface flow paths, and understanding this water that doesn't look perfectly like modern water or precipitation. So a companion to this study, we recently published a USGS scientific investigation report. So some of the springs and rivers of this region had been sampled by the USGS in the 1970s, and we resampled these same systems again here in the 2020s. And this plot on the left is showing sort of the evolution over that time period of some simple tracers, specific conductance. We also looked at pH, and we found that both of these increased over this approximately 50-year time frame, which we can conceptualize as, we know when we're talking about our shallowest water and our super permafrost aquifers that we have this layered system where we have organic material and dead vegetation closer to the surface. And as we move deeper, we get into some mineral soils before hitting a frozen boundary. And so we look at these signatures, and this could be explained by a slight deepening of our shallow subsurface flow paths. So less of an influence of the organic soils and more influence from the mineral soils, leading to both an increase in the conductivity of those soils, as well as potentially an increase in the pH if we have fewer organic acids derived from that shallowest organic material. So another clue to what's happening in the subsurface comes from our looking again at the pterogenic helium and the ratio of our helium isotopes. So on the left here again, showing that most of our springs look to be almost perfectly like modern atmosphere, and then both the Saddle LaRoche and Red Hill springs tend to show evidence of this radiogenic helium accumulation. On the right, this is a plot showing actually the discharge of our nearest stream gauge, which is on the Hula Hula River, and then the red dots are indicating the pterogenic helium, and this is across one summer. So demonstrating that the concentration of pterogenic helium can vary pretty substantially. We're on a logarithmic scale here for for both axes, but demonstrating that it seems with a storm event or higher hydrographs, we can get some flushing of old water, and then that signal quickly recedes as the hydrograph drops. And so this is sort of reminds me of a work by some sort of pioneering work by Jim Kirchner, a hydrologist, which I always love the title of this paper, A Double Paradox in Catchment Hydrology and Geochemistry. And the paradox is this idea that we can have what looks like very old water, but that can be flushed from these environments very quickly by a storm event. And so one way to explain this sort of paradoxical signature is that really what we're talking about is not, or we're talking about flow that's shallow, that can be stored over longer time periods. And my best example, I think, of this is some work we did recently in interior Alaska, in the White Mountains, where we were looking at flow in these permafrost environments. Again, a situation where we have layered organics on top, some amount of mineral soil, and then continuous permafrost. And we added a tracer to the subsurface, and we put it in a large pulse that sort of raised the hydraulic head of the whole area. And in many of our wells, shown here in the middle, we see this rapid response of an increase in the solute concentration as it breaks through past all these wells, and then a quick decline. And then this red square indicating a few anomalous wells where this signature and this exchange of solute is much, much slower than what we would expect or what we'd see in the other places. And the way we explain this is to have these areas that are not exchanging quickly, so they're less permeable, less conductive than the surrounding organic material that's able to store our solutes over some time span, but then can still release it as we have these changes in hydraulic head related to a perturbation. In this case, adding in a tracer and then ceasing the addition on the North Slope, where we're talking more about the influence of rain in its ability to cause this exchange between our aquifers and aquatards. The final piece of evidence that we thought about for this study was to think about alpha ice fields and their size over the last several decades. So we were using remote sensing of sort of the common alpha ice fields and looking at how they change from year to year. And we certainly see some trends, but perhaps even more interesting than that is that we see a lot of interannual variability. We were able to show that this alpha ice size correlates to conditions from the previous years in many cases where we have a warmer winter or a larger snow or rainfall year can result in larger alpha ice the following year, implying that there's some amount of storage and transmission of this water on rapid timescales or annual timescales. The other interesting thing is the difference in the trends over the last several decades. So some of our alpha ice fields are decreasing in time, and this is pretty consistent with the idea that we have maybe more winter flow, which means less alpha ice formation, or we have warmer springs leading to faster thaw. But in some cases, our alpha ice fields are increasing in size. So again, pointing to potentially the more subsurface dynamics and changes to the way that water is routed through the subsurface. This could be an indication that we are having thickening of this talc and more connectivity in these shallow super permafrost soils that's allowing more water to make it to these alpha ice fields and freeze over the winter months. So these were the pieces of data that we brought together to create this new conceptual model, really focused on these shallow super permafrost aquifers and potentially talc development. So again, just to summarize, we see that our river flow is derived from local precipitation following short flow paths. It looks like modern water. Generally, the springs are contributing to our winter water, and they're not 100% young water, but many of the springs is young, and even those that show some fraction of old tend to be dominated by young water. So generally we're talking about water that's less than 30 years old, although we're having some mixing with some water that's been or solute tracers that have been in the subsurface for longer time scales. And again, pointing to this exchange of permeable and impermeable, or water stored in permeable and impermeable layers in the near surface. So when we think about what this means for these systems, for our water resources, certainly the water resources are limited, but potentially growing as we have more talc development in this super permafrost environment. So I think there are still big questions about exactly what this talc looks like and how this increased hydrologic connectivity is coming about. When we're thinking about our ecosystems, in the short term, this certainly could be a positive thing. If there's more water reaching our rivers in the winter, it may be providing greater habitat or helping to connect some of that under ice habitat that's so critical for these species. Of course, we may also expect to see some changes in our base flow. Some previous work has demonstrated that these alpha ice tend to maintain summer base flows. And so if our alpha ice field size changes, this may also have an impact on our river hydrographs. But of course, as we've shown, this can be really dependent on which specific basin we're looking at and the geometry of whether the alpha ice fields are increasing or decreasing and how that relates to these flow paths reaching the rivers. When we think about contaminant transport, so our age tracers provide a mean age, where we realize, of course, that when it comes to the movement of solutes, that can happen much faster than those mean ages. So where we're talking about, a range of ages from 0 to 30 years, really when we think about contaminant transport, it's likely that those timescales for moving contaminants into these river systems is much faster. So as I alluded to, I think there are still some major questions, and Ava has already grilled me on this a bit, so you can talk to her about it too. I'll be curious to hear her thoughts. But certainly, what we've demonstrated here is that we have evidence of young water, and that hydrologic connectivity or talic development exists. But what that looks like in the subsurface, how that connectivity comes about, is still a really good question. Certainly, there's been previous work demonstrating the importance of thaw bulbs around streams and rivers, and these linear features could certainly be important for creating these sorts of transport corridors. A few of the winter water sources that we did sample are located at the mouths where streams meet the larger river, so some evidence there maybe that those are important features. I think more work is done to also think about specific soil types and how they're connected or disconnected across the landscape, and how important they might be. And of course, some of our other big questions are related then to the implications of this work for the movement of things like carbon and contaminants. And so that's a bit of what we're working on next. Our focus will be a little more in the Brooks Range, but also some on the North Slope, using these same tracers to sample more broadly, and we'll be bringing in some drilling and some geophysics to really try to think about that subsurface geometry a little better, and see if we can better conceptualize exactly what's happening in that subsurface environment that's so hard to see. And that's all I have for today. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Josh. We'll go ahead with some questions. I see Katie has her hand raised. I'm gonna go ahead.
Hi, Josh. Thank you. That was very interesting. And I was just wondering, what does this all mean? If a lot of the water is shallow and that means has a relatively young residence time, what does this mean for the deep aquifers? What is the exchange of water with those deep aquifers? Probably there's always some water moving down into them, but that means they have to resurface somewhere. So when and where does that deep, older water, deeper in the ground, ever reach the surface? And
yeah, that's a great question, and I don't think I have any data that can really point to that. I've certainly seen more literature recently thinking about groundwater exchange with the near shore marine environment, and so that could be one place. I think we were expecting that we would see more evidence of these springs having some sort of two-way communication with deeper aquifers, but yeah, I don't know. I mean, the permafrost here is certainly thick, and I don't know if the fault system exists for there to be that exchange. So we certainly didn't have evidence to point to that.
Jessica?
Hi, thank you. That was a informative presentation. I have my baby here with me, so I'll talk kind of quietly. So if I'm too quiet, let me know. Um, but are the characteristics of the ice in the permafrost similar to sea ice? Like the older the ice is, the more it pushes out the ions that are in the ice?
I believe that is. Well, I'm sorry. So are you talking about the alpha ice in the rivers, or the permafrost, or?
Permafrost.
Yeah, I think that is true, although I'm certainly not a permafrost expert. But that is something we were thinking about with the alpha ice. and that was a question: is why didn't we sample more of the alpha ice to try to look at the chemistry there? But it was because of those challenges of solute exclusion that we weren't sure that sampling the ice itself would be telling us about the flow paths.
Mm.
And certainly these alpha ice, they really can be very layered. You can drill through meters of ice and then start to hit those water layers and then back into ice, and so it gets really complex to know exactly what you're looking at and where the chemical signature is coming from.
Cool. Yep, I was just asking because I'm from the southwest region of Alaska where everything's kind of thawing and like sinking in. And if there's like a layer of permafrost, ground, ice-rich permafrost, ground, ice-rich permafrost, then that might be it might look young, but the ice might be really old. It
Mm-hmm.
just pushed out all the salt like chlorine and sodium. So thank you.
Thanks.
You are welcome to put your question in the chat as well. And we did have a couple questions from our community. One of the question was, I think you mentioned a bit like going ahead some of the remaining question and trying to refine the conceptual model. But did you see any variability in the thallic development that would kind of help identify some of the key terrain settings where flow path could develop?
Yeah, so our methods we're solely looking at the water, and so that has the benefit that it's integrating a lot of what's happening on the landscape, because you've already had all those flow paths come together, and so unfortunately that means that you then can't learn as much about sort of the heterogeneity of those different environments. And so we really can't say anything about sort of the distribution or variability in what those thallics might look like from this work.
Thanks. And
But
I
it
guess
makes us want to go back out there.
yeah, definitely. And a follow-up question is, so the work was focused in the NWAR, the 1002 area, but talking results applying to continuous permafrost. How representative you think it is, those findings to the broader northern Alaska, and even like if we go across the border as well?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and that's a great question. Our spatial scale was, we have samples from the mountains through the foothills and down onto the coastal plain, and right, certainly we know that western north slope of Alaska looks very different. It's much more lake rich. We see less evidence of these alpha ice fields and these springs. So I think this is probably relevant to those foothill regions, but that's less of a component in the western Alaska. Certainly, we read a lot of the literature from Canada and Russia, where many people have been thinking about alpha ice, and if there are ways to look at trends in alpha ice to learn something about groundwater and thallics, and there are other studies that have shown these short or fast timescale links between alpha ice field size and characteristics and previous year's climate. So I think in that sense, I think that these findings are likely relevant to other areas that have alpha ice or these small springs, but obviously there are differences that are going to exist related to geology and even within in our landscape demonstrate, we see these differences between different alpha ice features that sort of point to, well, I guess we don't know what they point to, but some intriguing ideas about how different just catchment characteristics or slope or size might influence that connectivity of subsurface flow paths and travel.
I see a couple of questions in the chat from Jessica. If the CI is pretty low for this water flow model, how would other region, not sure, understand. Do you see there?
I accidentally hit return instead of shift. I'm typing one-handed.
Do you wanna verbally share your question?
Oh, sure. So if this model is pretty decent, how would other regions use this model to like estimate how the water's flowing in the subsurface for like community use? Like let's say Bethel, the hub community of the southwest region of Alaska, if they have permafrost thaw, how would a city planner in Bethel be able to use a model like this to say, don't build there, water's flowing under that surface. Build over here, there's not really much water flow.
Yeah, I think what we've shown is sort of the potential, or the idea that this subsurface water is moving and connected to our surface water streams. But I think there are more questions. I think it leads to more questions that it answers in terms of I think there are other studies that are looking at specific talics, or monitoring subsurface conditions in specific location to think about water movement, or the thaw and subsidence of the landscape with permafrost thaw. And I think those sorts of methods are maybe more helpful for thinking about where is there lots of water moving, and and how might that impact infrastructure.
Thank you. And we have a question from Tom Glass. Thanks for a great talk related to the last question. It was a little bit ago, but I'm curious about the difference between springs inside versus outside floodplain, such as the Saddler-O-Chicks versus the Cooperuk I-5 spring. Do you think placement can tell us something about the water's origin and subsurface flow paths?
Yeah, that's a great question. Yeah, I certainly I wish we had more springs. I think that one nice thing about this was that we showed that generally the age tracers agreed with sort of more basic hydrochemistry, and ion loads, major ion loads. And I think from what I've seen, and certainly that Doug Kane paper from 2013 had a larger sample of springs. And so I think there can be some clues as to differences between the systems based on that chemistry that could be worth revisiting. It would be great to have the age tracers everywhere as well, but they tend to be just more expensive and harder to sample. So I think there are probably differences between systems that provide some clues as to what that subsurface might look like. But I think there's work to be done there. And yeah, please let me know if I didn't exactly answer your question, or if there are other things you were thinking about. All right, inside versus outside floodplains. Yeah, and that's a great point. Is, I mean, for the most part, our springs that we sampled were outside of floodplains. The alpha ice tells us a little something, but it's much harder to be sure of what you're getting there. Often when we're in those floodplains, we're sampling already mixed water, and so it can be a little trickier to be certain if we're really getting a true groundwater source. And we tried a few different ways and didn't have a whole lot of success. So I think there's definitely work to be done on those inside of floodplain type of samples.
Thank you. Do we have some last question before we wrap up? Maybe not. thanks again, Josh. That was very interesting, and looking forward to more advancement on the conceptual model. So before we wrap up the meeting for next month, we'll have a webinar by Dr. Mackenzie Kuhn. Maybe Kyle, actually, if you're on the call, if you want to briefly share about this.
Yeah, sure. Happy to share. Yeah, next month we're excited to have Dr. Mackenzie Kuhn from the University of British Columbia joining us to talk about her work upscaling methane emissions across the Arctic Boreal region using the bald wetland database and the bald methane data set. Yeah, so excited. That's on November 12th, I believe. Is that the right date? Yeah.
Well, thank you again. Thanks, Josh, and everyone for joining. And we'll see you in November.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks. Bye.